Welcome to Solutions Rising. I am so pleased to welcome Polly Ryan, again, a horticulturist, and Leigh Youngblood, Executive Director of Mount Grace Land Conservation Trust. I'm so happy that both of them are joining me today. Such knowledgeable and prestigious guests this morning, both of whom are affected landowners on the proposed Kinder Morgan Tennessee gas pipeline. This is Beat 17, a Solutions Rising series to stop this proposed pipeline, and we are taping on Saturday, September 12th. First, once again, and very important, I must continue to thank all the community television stations who are carrying our show. Their support is crucial to getting as much information as possible out to all of us who want and need to be as informed as possible to protect our children, our health, our safety, our homes, the land, the wetlands, the earth, and the planet. Just a quick update. FERC has had scoping meetings that were attended in very high numbers in Pittsfield and Greenfield and Nashua and Milford, New Hampshire, to name a few. As of today, one more FERC scoping meeting will be held in Ringe, New Hampshire on September 29th at 6 p.m. And I think all of you would like to know, I think primarily because of much public and legislative pressure, FERC has extended the comment period to October 16th. These are comments from the public FERC is required to receive as preparation for the environmental impact statement. Okay, here we go. I did want to say one more thing. I was in Nashua, New Hampshire, and I heard FERC representatives at the Nashua scoping meeting telling the audience that they needed to allow Kinder Morgan Tennessee gas, that the landowners needed to allow them to survey their properties to help FERC make its decision on the permit. And I must say this was astounding to me, and we will discuss that shortly. So, Polly, you are a landowner whose property is directly affected by this proposed pipeline in Plainfield. And Plainfield is also right next door to Windsor, where the proposed compressor station is planned. So we really need to hear your concerns and everything you want to tell us about how this must feel to you.
Well, Rachel, initially my primary concerns were for my family's health and safety. Where safety is concerned, I read this research paper called a model for sizing high consequence areas with natural gas pipelines. And it was made for the Gas Research Institute. And basically it's a study on what the radius is of the impacted zone should there be a pipeline accident. And you know, they do all these calculations to figure out, based on the size of the pipe and the amount of pressure that's in the pipe, what would be incinerated within that radius. And for a 36-inch pipe that is under 1,400 pounds per square inch, that's 900 feet. And even downsized at 30 inches, that's 800 feet under 1,400 pounds per square inch pressure. And the pipeline's going to be within less than 300 feet of my house. And according to FERC regulations, the pipeline can be as close as 25 feet to people's homes. So we're in the incineration zone.
I didn't hear about the incineration zone until I went to Stephentown, and that is absolutely frightening.
Yeah,
as frightening
it's
as it can possibly be.
Absolutely the scariest thing. You know, I have grandchildren, I have a 16-year-old son. You know, I just would not feel comfortable putting them in that circumstance. And then in terms of health, I've also researched this quite a bit, and you know, there are a lot of places along the pipeline, I mean, the pipeline leaks 3 or 4% naturally, even with all the welds and everything. But along the pipeline, there's places where they do intentional off-gassing. And natural gas, you know, the primary element is methane, which is horrible for in terms of global warming. But there are also other chemicals in it that are residues from the fracking process. And those chemicals are known carcinogens. They even list you on the Kinder Morgan fact sheet, benzene and toluene. You can look at the OSHA sheets, they cause cancer. There are other chemicals that people have said are endocrine inhibitors. That means that they mess with your reproductive states. And then the final one is neurotoxins. And neurotoxins, you know, long-term exposure to that will cause diseases like MS.
Are you a biologist? Are you a biologist?
Well, I have a degree in plant and soil science from UMass.
You have quite
So I have a lot of science background, and I've worked as a research technician, and I've actually worked with benzene and toluene, and in the lab you have to wear gloves, you have to do it under a laminar flow hood so the gas, you don't breathe the gas because it's toxic.
And of course, I think one of the things that's important, you know, you hear so much about jobs, is we have over 25,000 leaks in Massachusetts. Those are jobs right there that need to be, those leaks need to be cleaned up before we even begin to think about any proposed pipeline.
I completely agree.
Yep. And I think, Leigh, we really need to hear a little bit about your whole area of expertise as the executive director of the Mount Grace Conservation Law Trust. And welcome to the program.
Well, thank you very much, Rachel. So Mount Grace Land Conservation Trust, like the Berkshire Natural Resources Council, we are one of 150 land trusts across the state. And land trusts are charitable nonprofits, and we help landowners to permanently protect their land, working with state, municipal, and other foundation partners. Since 1986, Mount Grace has worked with hundreds of landowners to permanently protect 29,000 acres. And we also have responsibilities for stewarding land and conservation restrictions that we've helped conserve. I want to explain a little bit about what a conservation restriction is. Many people will be familiar with farmland that's protected but still privately owned. And how that happens is through an agricultural restriction. So when I say conservation restriction, it's the same as an agricultural preservation restriction. And those are tools that are used to permanently protect land. And in fact, the IRS requires, if you want a donation, tax deduction for donating a conservation restriction, it has to be restricted in perpetuity.
Which means it cannot be undone.
That has to be the clear intent at the beginning. And so these are really strong tools for establishing the status of conservation land, whether it's public conservation land or nonprofit conservation land. Now, when it comes to public conservation land or conservation restrictions that are held by the state or by towns, there's a provision of our Constitution, Article 97, which protects and defends. So we have our Constitution that not just protects our rights as people, but also land that's dedicated to conservation. And this was passed in 1972 by public referendum. And I want to quote just a little bit of it, right? The people went to the polls to change the Constitution for these protections of conserved land because it's set aside for clean air, clean water, recreation, food growing, you know, so that people see the importance of that. So in our Constitution reads in part under Article 97, the people shall have the right to clean air and water, freedom from excessive and unnecessary noise, and people have the right to the natural, scenic, historic, and aesthetic qualities of their environment. But the unique and most important part of Article 97 in Massachusetts says that lands and easements taken or acquired for conservation purposes shall not be used for other purposes or otherwise disposed of except by laws enacted by 2/3 vote, taken by yeas and nays of each branch of the general court. So both the House and Senate of Massachusetts have to vote by roll call to undo conservation land. And that is a step that Kinder Morgan is required to go through when they negotiate with the state or private parties to undo permanently protected land. And we want the legislators to vote no.
And that's a name call. We have to know exactly, if that ever reaches that stage, who is voting yay or nay on this,
Yes.
if they tried it.
And in the path of the pipeline, there are more than 110 permanently protected parcels, some of these protected for more than 100 years. And that means state parks, state forests, state wildlife management areas, farms, municipal watershed land, land that's owned by land trusts. And these are places that we know, let's see, there's, I wanted to name some public places that people might recognize. The Pittsfield State Forest, for example, is
In the Clarksburg State Forest, where
yes, and the
all
north.
your state forests would be protected under.
Oh, they're protected, and
They
these are the
all
ones that
are.
I wanted to mention. The 110 are the ones that are challenged by the pipeline, that the pipeline proposes to cross. And in order for them to put an easement, for the Commonwealth to sell an easement, there has to be a vote of the legislature. And we want the legislature to say no, because even with a no vote in the legislature, Kinder Morgan could still get its permit and get the power of eminent domain. But there's a provision in FERC's own rules that say that the more eminent domain that's used, the higher the bar for proving the benefit of the pipeline. So when private landowners like Polly or conservation landowners like Mount Grace say, no, we're not going to sell you an easement, you have to take it by eminent domain. And if the legislature says, no, we're not selling you an easement on the state forest, you have to take it by eminent domain, that raises the bar. And we know that in the FERC docket, plenty of alternatives have been proven to be available. And I believe that with a no vote, it will make it impossible for Kinder Morgan to prove that the benefit of this pipeline is so high that we should undermine these constitutional protections.
You just said 110 of these conserved lands are impacted by this proposed pipeline?
Just in Massachusetts alone, yeah.
Yes, just in Massachusetts.
And so
Yeah.
people can look at this FERC policy. It's PL 99-3. And it just clearly says that the greater the use of eminent domain, the stronger the case the pipeline company must make of the public benefits of its proposal. So we feel it's very important for the legislatures to say, no, we're not going to convey an easement. If you want an easement, you have to prove the benefit is really worth it.
And a FERC permit, from what I understand, is supposed to be for public necessity and convenience. And none of this, as far as I can see, comes under that at all. This is totally inconvenient and far worse than that. Seriously
That's right.
crucial to air and water and all the other things that we care about. But I'd like to go back and talk a little bit about, or go on and talk a little bit about eminent domain. And Polly, do you want to speak a little bit about?
Yeah.
I know, as I said at the beginning, to hear FERC representatives say that people need to complete the survey so they could make their decision. This goes against what I believe is that we should not be doing surveys. Would you like to speak to that?
Yeah, well, in
And on
terms
your
of
own property too.
yeah, in terms of the surveys, Kinder Morgan, people should be doing their own homework about what inventory is on their land, and like vernal pools or ledge that they might have to blast through. Or in my case, I bought my property because it has 2 feet of black gold, literally 2 feet of topsoil that is just prime farmland, and with the intention of farming it when I retire. And
You told me something before this program about what you intend to do. It's a wonderful
yeah,
future that you're laying out for yourself. Would you tell our viewing audience about that?
Yeah, well, my intention is when I retire to have a B&B on my property and to grow organic vegetables, and actually I'm a great cook and serve that as part of my guests' visit. And
you are
but-
very, very close to as I
a
said,
compressor station.
compressor
Yeah.
station.
I'm 4 miles downwind of it. So in essence, if my concerns around the chemicals, I wouldn't be able to really farm organically because all of those would, there's sulfuric acid, and that causes acid rain, and that changes the pH of the soil. And so all of these conditions would make it difficult for farming, let alone what happens during construction when, they say they're only going to take off the first 12 inches of soil, separate that from the subsoil when they dig the trench. And then on farmland, if you ask for it, they'll put it back that way. But in my case, I have 24 inches. And so I'd have to negotiate to separate that out. And then, but there's soil compaction from all of the heavy equipment. So in essence, it doesn't really matter that they put the soil back, right? If they've compacted it, it renders it basically useless. And they've also told us that on the permanent easement, the permanent 50-foot easement, you're not allowed to drive a tractor over it. You're not allowed to grow anything on it. You can't build on it.
And that affects the value of your home.
Right.
It affects your quality of life. And you have not allowed...
I've heard that property values are depreciated by 30%. I've also heard that, it's possible that I'll not be able to resell my property because a lot of mortgage lenders do not, they have a clause that don't allow for explosives on your property. So you can't get a mortgage if you have an explosive on your property. And then there's liability issues and whether insurance companies will give you homeowners insurance for this. And if I want to start a business, that's even more problematic because, that will be considered in a business loan or business insurance.
Do you think the value of the properties around you are already decreasing because of this proposed pipeline?
Oh, I know they are. My neighbors have been trying to sell their property for over a year now, and it hasn't budged. And I overheard a conversation just a week ago with a real estate agent and a couple that were there, and they have to disclose that the pipeline is going to go in. And that is a real deterrent.
The proposed pipeline.
The proposed pipeline,
which we are
yes.
not letting go in.
Exactly right.
So you are one of the people who declined to
Yes, I
let them
declined
survey.
permission to survey, and that's because I want to make a statement that I'm opposed to the pipeline. And but I do recommend that homeowners take their own inventory and at some point make people aware of the things that will be impacted on that land. And, Kinder Morgan is supposed to assess this and put it in their resource report.
Is that one of those two TBD,
Yes.
to be determined unanswered questions that they still
Right.
have not, I know at every community meeting I've been, they do not answer the questions that
Right.
people are really asking, but they talk a good game. But
I
when
just-
you're talking about, I'm sorry.
I just wanted to say some other things about eminent domain and how I've had to actually consider that as an impacted landowner. And, when I mentioned those health and safety concerns in the beginning, I have had to think about whether or not I really want to stay on my land. And so, that means that I might have to sell it if I'm really concerned about those things. But I've heard that Kinder Morgan's negotiation for landowners, their initial negotiation for landowners, is that they will give you $1 per inch of the size of the pipe. So if it's a 30-inch pipe, that's $30. And then they'll give you $1 per foot that it crosses your property. And they'll times it by that. So that's, in my case, it's 50 feet, so that's $50. So that's $30 times $50, which is $1,500 for a permanent easement on my land that I can't drive a tractor on, grow anything on, and I continue to pay taxes for. And
also responsible for liability.
And responsible for the liability. So because of the health and safety concerns, and because that's the initial terms for the easement, I want to say to Kinder Morgan, no, I want you to buy my property. But they don't like to do that because it'll cost them too much. So the only way I may get that is by holding out for eminent domain. And
if they should possibly get this permit and come in and try to use eminent domain, that will have to be legally adjudicated, because they will have to pay fair market value, and fair market value has to be determined prior to this proposed pipeline coming from.
My understanding of eminent domain is that it only happens if Kinder Morgan is issued a permit, and then it's only exercised if the landowner and Kinder Morgan cannot come to terms on the easement agreement or contract. And so in that case, it goes to a local court where a judge and possibly even a jury decide on the terms of the easement. And in that case, you can say, I want them to buy the entire piece of property. And in most cases where this has happened, landowners have gotten fair market value for their property.
So, and that will be another show talking about all the legal possibilities of protecting landowners and all of us who are affected by this proposed Kinder Morgan. And of course, I can imagine the health stress. Endocrine disruptors from the gas itself, but the stress for all the people whose land is impacted is just so.
Yeah,
so
basically, it's put my life in limbo, for the past year and a half. I feel like I can't make any decisions about my future because I don't know. My future is based on my land. It's my one and only asset. I built the home myself. I raised my children in it. And I plan to retire there.
Polly, I think you're speaking for a lot of people who are crying and are terribly frightened by this whole prospect of proposed pipeline.
Yeah.
And Leigh, how do you in the Mount Grace Conservation Land Trust help consumers and to protect their lands, landowners to protect their lands?
Right. So, I mentioned that Mount Grace has worked with hundreds of landowners to permanently protect their land. And part of Mount Grace's mission is also to encourage stewardship. So even if a landowner isn't ready for conservation, we try to give them information about whether it's current use property taxes under Chapter 61, or forest stewardship, or farm conservation. So the idea of landowner rights is something that is the basis of land trust work. And so this is why Mount Grace took it so seriously when first the initial pipeline proposal was passing through more of our region and was passing through another piece of farmland in Montague that we held a conservation restriction on, and we hired an attorney to look into this question of access for surveys. And we have a legal memo on our website, mountgrace.org, that outlines the property rights of landowners relative to the permission to survey. And I'm really glad to have a chance to mention this because I understand there's a brand new round of letters to landowners requesting permission to survey. And when Mount Grace sent that 33-page legal memo back in May of 2014, all of the requests for surveys stopped because it was very well researched and it empowers landowners to say no. Kinder Morgan doesn't have eminent domain now. Let's not act like they do. Let's defend private property rights. And that is something, so we encourage that now for the survey issue. I encourage anyone can bring that memo to their own lawyer and say, help me say no to the pipeline. If you've given permission and want to change your mind, you can go to No Frack Gas and
Is that
rescind
memo
permission.
on the Mount Grace website?
Yes, the legal memo is at mountgrace.org.
Which is on our screen now, mountgrace.org.
And just search for pipeline, and it'll take you to the pipeline page. And right at the bottom, there's a list of documents of different pieces of information about the pipeline, and that legal memo is right there. And when it comes to eminent domain, so we won't allow them on the land that we own, and we certainly think that, no conservation land should be compromised for a pipeline that's not needed. So there's no reason to cooperate with them because there are alternatives. And we will not be conveying easements, and we encourage the legislature to say no and raise that bar of eminent domain, and think that private landowners like Polly should also not cooperate with the pipeline because the pipeline's not needed. And FERC is doing a cost-benefit analysis, and the more costs there are, like the cost to society and to private property rights of eminent domain, again, they have to show more benefit, and we don't see the benefit of the pipeline. There are alternatives that have less impacts to the environment and less impacts to the Constitution of Massachusetts, and we should uphold all those rights and tools that we can use.
Including energy efficiency, renewable and sustainable energies, and put the sunshine on everything. And
That's the most cost-effective way to get more energy is to conserve. How about insulation for these homes?
Yeah.
And despite all of my life being in limbo, I am putting solar panels on my house. I figured out it is cost effective to do that. It's going to cost me nothing more than what it already cost me for my electric bill. And it's going to pay for itself in 5 years.
That's fantastic. So we want to encourage everybody to take a
Insulate.
piece of that sun, insulate,
Solar
weatherization.
energy.
There are all kinds of programs that you can, Berkshire Community Action Council, in all the areas there are weatherization programs and energy efficiency, and you can find them. And I'm so grateful for the two of you coming, and I really hope you will come back again. I just consider right now, after this whole fight to stop this proposed pipeline, that this is, I consider the whole Commonwealth of Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and New York, that we are trying to put it under conservation trust in our hearts and in what we are doing. So thank you so much for being with me. And as I say, if each one of us picked up one problem and solved it, imagine the incredible view we would all have of solutions rising. And we are here to give you as much information as we can, and you know how to find us, and you can contact us. And as I say after each show now on our series, and the beat goes on. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rachel.